Students at Utah Valley University are returning to class for the first time since conservative activist Charlie Kirk was shot and killed last week on their campus. And we're also learning more about the 22-year-old murder suspect Tyler Robinson. According to court documents, Robinson confessed in messages to his roommate, writing about Kirk, quote, "I had enough of his hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated out." Joining us now is CNN legal analyst Carrie Cordero. Carrie, good to have you here. So listen to what the prosecutor said at yesterday's news conference.
Robinson's mother explained that over the last year or so, Robinson had become more political and had started to lean more to the left, becoming more pro-gay and trans rights oriented. She stated that Robinson began to date his roommate, a biological male who was transitioning genders. This resulted in several discussions with family members, but especially between Robinson and his father, who have very different political views.
So for someone without a legal background, this case may feel cut and dry, right? But explain why authorities still haven't come out and said they nailed down a precise motive here.
Well, I think it's important for us to distinguish between the legal case that the prosecutors actually have to bring, which in some ways is straightforward. This is a state and local prosecution, and the main charge is aggravated murder. And so from that perspective, what they really need to focus is on the specific evidence that they have to prove that charge and some of the other ancillary charges like obstruction of justice, tampering with witnesses that they've brought against this individual. Separate from that is the part of this event that is important from a national conversation and a public policy perspective, and that is the motivation for this individual because it appears to be a political assassination. And so that's why there's not an urgency from the perspective of the criminal case that these prosecutors have to protect the integrity of and bring and prosecute this individual versus answering the questions that are very important to the national dialogue with respect to this national tragedy.
And when you look at that charge, aggravated murder, you mentioned that. Why is that so significant in the state of Utah?
Well, the state of Utah, as I understand, is a death penalty state, and the government officials there have said that they will seek the death penalty in this case, given just the amount of very clear evidence that they've laid out in just the limited charging document that they've provided so far. It appears that they have a good amount of evidence, both forensic evidence and text messages, for example, between the defendant and his roommate and partner. And they're very clear, I mean, when you see them laid out in the charging document. So the only issue really, if that evidence is as strong as it appears, is whether or not this individual ends up pleading and whether the death penalty then becomes part of the conversation in that potential plea.
The suspect is also charged with 2 counts of tampering with a witness for directing his roommate and partner to delete those text messages and stay silent about the attack. Now, authorities say the roommate is cooperating. But does it surprise you at all that the roommate isn't at this point facing any sort of legal repercussions?
All I have to go on is the text messages that the authorities have provided publicly so far. And based on just the plain text of those messages, it doesn't appear that the roommate was involved. But obviously there will be an investigation that is continuing. And so they will look into other aspects of the roommate's behavior and any other information they found out about the defendant's activities prior to the event to determine whether anybody else was involved.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but we still don't know if the roommate alerted authorities to the text exchange and Robinson, or if authorities identified Robinson and then tracked down the roommate. But what would the legal obligation be, if any, for the roommate to tell authorities about these text messages?
Well, so prosecutors can serve legal process to an individual to compel them to provide information. And I'm not sure we know at this point whether or not this individual was compelled to produce text messages or whether this individual voluntarily provided information. People can do both. They can provide information voluntarily, they can be compelled, or authorities can go and get legal process or serve warrants on the defendant's devices themselves. So there's a variety of mechanisms that law enforcement has available to it to obtain that type of evidence.
So before we go, I want to ask you about what Deputy Attorney General told my colleague Caitlin Collins about the idea of potential investigations into those who protest the president. This is pretty extraordinary. Would the White House have a case for that? He talked about wanting to look into the groups that could be behind these protesters.
Well, there's a wide variety of types of protest activity, and as a very, very general matter, protest activity is protected by the First Amendment. Violence is not. And so it really would depend on the specific facts, how the Justice Department is going to approach actual protest activity that is purely First Amendment protected versus if they have information to suggest in the course of their responsibilities, for example, under the Justice Department or the FBI, that protest activity has something that is going to turn violent or there's some threat involved in it. We are in an environment where political figures obviously are in a significant threat environment, and there are real public safety concerns for not just the president, but public figures, both elected and non-elected. So I think it's hard at this point, just based on those statements, to parse the nature of what the Justice Department might be thinking regarding its protective responsibilities to potentially prevent acts of violence against political figures versus just trying to crack down on protected protest activity.
All right, Carrie Cordero, as always, thank you.